Pat McDonald, you're dressed. I see that bear's orange, but I also think that
Yes.
you just dressed up in orange and I'm in green to celebrate Halloween season because we're in spooky season right now.
Is orange and green the colors of Halloween? I know orange is.
Well, I'm thinking like there's the
Aren't
orange of the pumpkin and the green of the stem, that kind of a thing.
ah, you glad you meet me?
I'm I'm always glad to know you, Pat. But and so as people know, I'm dedicating October to exclusively like horror and genre content. And that
Yeah,
includes all aspects of it, including the film we're going to talk about today, which I don't think anybody associates with being a horror film. But I think thematically, there's a lot there. And we're talking about Sofia Coppola's directorial, unbelievably, her directorial debut,
yes.
1999's The Virgin Suicides, which that has a horror movie title to it. But
Right.
it's a film that I had not watched since I saw it in the theaters, 22 or 23 years ago. And
Yeah.
watching it now, I forgot how like quirky and weird it is up until that very last bit dip into surrealism and darkness at the end, which culminates in spoiler alert, the Virgin Suicides. What's your experience with this movie in terms of watching it, appreciating it?
Well, and I sent you a little note yesterday. I know I'd seen it, okay? It was just one of those films that everybody had to see during that time if you were a film buff and all that, and buzz, buzz, buzz around. And all I remembered from it were the dreamy sequences. Oh, I remembered two things about it. The first suicide of the daughter, where she jumps and impales herself onto a fence, because you really can't forget that if you do see that depicted on screen. And then the other thing was just the dreaminess of it, the dreaminess of the girls, and the way that Coppola, which became her signature, kind of creates a state in her films. So those are the two things, and otherwise completely forgot everything about the plot. I remember the name Trip because
Trip
Trip
Fontaine, yeah.
became a hot name for a while after that movie came out. So that was it. Everything else was brand new in a sense. But you're
So
talking a 23-year 3-year gap.
right, and
My memory's shot from last week, sir, much less 23 years ago.
well, it is we have the kind of a similar experience then because watching it, I remembered kind of impressions like, oh yeah, this feels familiar, but it was like
Right.
seeing it for the first time. And I do remember that the first time I saw it in a theater, there was actually a fire alarm that went off about three-quarters of the way through. And so we had to
Oh my
exit and then
gosh.
come back and then try and get back into the rhythm of this weird movie. It was very strange. Um, but yeah, so
That's cool.
it takes place in the 1970s in a Michigan suburb. You've got the Lisbon
Gross Point.
family. Is it Moose Point?
No, Gross Point.
Gross Point.
Like
Okay.
Gross Point Blank. Two big movies set in Gross Point. Because the
Ooh,
original author, Jeffrey Eugenides, was from Detroit, Gross Point area.
that'd be an interesting double feature. Um,
Yes, it would.
but we'll
Make
get
sure
to the
there's
movie.
no.
Oh,
Go
well,
ahead.
I was going to say we'll get to the film that I think is a direct companion piece to this in just a bit, but I
Okay.
want to set up what this movie is about. So it's the Lisbon family. It's mom and dad. Dad is the high school math teacher and math and science, and he's got five daughters, ages 13 through 17. So they're a very
Right.
busy family, and they're all going to the same high school together. Strict religious upbringing. Mostly, you get the sense enforced by the mother, played by Kathleen Turner. The dad is played by
Right.
James Woods, and the youngest was it Cecilia? Yeah, she, as you mentioned, jumps out of a window, impaling herself on a fence. Now, it's weird because later on in the film, there is a reference to, I thought, her having slit her wrists. I don't know
Yes.
what that
Well,
was
she
about.
started the process because she had attempted a
Oh, right.
suicide.
Okay.
Yeah,
That was
yeah,
yeah, this is from like the very beginning of the movie. I was so like
right.
struck by that fence that I completely forgot her first attempt.
Yes, the fence is unforgettable. It just is. Yes,
Well, it's strange because we don't see her jump. The family throws a
right,
party, a rare party for the girls to have some neighborhood boys come over and hang out in the basement, you know, chaperoned, of course. Cecilia leaves the party early, and then I think mom goes upstairs and she starts or dad's already upstairs and there's some commotion, and then everyone kind of goes out to the front lawn and sees that around the side there's the wrought iron gate with these spires on it. And the
right,
tableau of this is very interesting because you see dad holding her up. It almost looks like he had impaled her on this fence. It's almost like awkward framing of the body. The young actress Hannah Hall. Um, it's a very striking scene because it doesn't look quite natural. I almost don't see how she could have fallen out of the window and landed in that exact pose. It's almost like a very like compositionally painterly idea, as if there's some kind of a metaphor
right,
rather than the literalness of the image.
right. It reminded me, in the sense, when you brought it up, of a religious statue, whereas,
Yeah.
almost like the Pieta, where, the Mary is cradling Christ off the cross.
Yeah.
I think Da Vinci did that, and yeah, it was framed as such, as if Woods were cradling her, although she was impaled. So yeah, it was a stark image, and again, one that I remember from the first viewing, because you can't forget an impaling on a fence from a suicide. So
Right.
unless
So
outside of a horror film.
well,
So
and this sort of kicks off. There's some media attention around the suicide, and that in that regard, it almost
right,
reminds me of Heather's. You've got the kind of concerned, gossiping parents. You've got the news anchor who's trying to make a big, deal out of it. Like, what does it mean? And we get these news reports of, it. It's almost perfect for 2022 in a way that it wasn't necessarily for 1999. The news
right,
reports of like kids are just so they're troubled and
right.
exposed to media now in a way that they've never been in history. And this is the early 1970s they're talking about, but it's, apt today with social media and all that.
Well, older generations love to exploit the delinquency of youth. I mean, when the teenage years were invented post World War II, because that's when the teenage market emerged because of the baby boom. Um, you had, Blackboard Jungle and The Wild One, and through the years, you always saw each generation give some example of teenage delinquency. It's just one of those themes that tells us, oh, our society is disintegrating. So
Yeah.
even though this was a look back, and one thing I'll say about Coppola, I don't know her age, but it has to be close to where I'm at. She may be about 3 or 4 years younger, but the experiences of the girls and the atmosphere of the 1970s. There's only one other film that I think gets it more um, timing like, and that's Dazed and Confused. Both made in the same decade, by the way.
Yeah.
Both by people who had gone through that era and was able in their mind to recreate the atmosphere of it, the feeling of it. That's what was so amazing. And both having significant scenes on a football field, I must say. I was like, wow, there's a double feature for you, Dazed and Confused and Virgin Suits. It'd be
we're gonna have
70s now, of course.
we're gonna have a full programming of Sophia Coppola Virgin Suicides related stuff.
Related double feature.
Now here's something interesting. Sophia
Yes.
Coppola, she because I just looked up her age. She was born in 71. So the
71? Oh, wow, of
71,
course, because she's the baby in The Godfather. Yes.
right. Um,
Oh, my.
so it's it's kind of like the movie Funny Pages, that was directed by Owen Klein, which came out recently. That
I
has a
loved
very
it. I love that movie, by the way.
Me too. And one of the things I loved about it is it captures someone wrote in to say that it was actually a contemporary film, but everything in it looks like it was from the mid 90s.
Right.
It has that feel to it. Owen Klein wasn't he is barely sentient in the mid 90s. And Sofia Coppola was probably the same way with the 70s. And yet both filmmakers were able to distill the essence of just being
Yeah,
sort of around there and turning that into a movie
right.
that feels like it was someone who was 25 when they, were walking around then.
Right, exactly. Well, I was 15 when the movie was set, so she was only 4. and and but I was like, how old? I couldn't put two and two together. And then of course, I remembered that she played the baby in The Godfather as soon as you said her
and
age.
and
So
and and reprised her role in Godfather 3.
yes, she did. Yes, she did
But
infamously.
yeah,
But
let's
she's
let's
also in Peggy Sue Got Married. She plays Peggy Sue's younger sister,
That's
and she
right.
seems, you know, that was a good performance
Also,
for a
I
minor
didn't
role.
draw right. I didn't draw that connection because that was a Kathleen Turner movie, and Kathleen Turner plays the
Exactly.
mom in this. Oh my
Right.
gosh. Okay,
I
so
know it. Well, don't read the Star Wars connections. It'll blow your mind.
Star oh well, yeah, because this was a zoetrope film, Lucas
Right.
and Coppola and all that. Yeah, I mean, okay, so it's officially a month-long Virgin Suicides inspired film festival we have going on. Um,
You could do it. You could do it.
well, I want to throw another movie onto the fire, and I teased it before. The film this most reminds me of, well, I'll save that for a second because we barely got through the synopsis. After the suicide, and there's all this attention and drama around it, the Lisbon girls, um, in school, they are these kind of mysterious,
Yeah.
they're very attractive, throughout the various ages, and they're a mystery. And every guy in the school wants to go out with them, and
Right.
amongst other things. At one point, the parents begrudgingly allow Trip Fontaine, who's like the big stud in the school, who has a
Trip
crush on Lux,
Fontaine.
played by
Good
Kirsten
name.
Dunst, right? Yeah, it's
Right.
totally a he needs like a mustache and a wah wah pedal, that guy. But but so Trip is like the big hot guy. He's like the quarterback on the football team. He takes a liking to Lux, who's a couple years younger than he is, because she's, I think, supposed to be
14.
14, played by Kirsten Dunst.
Yeah.
He's played by Josh Hartnett. The only way that he'll be able to take her out on a date is if he agrees to get some of his co-football player teammates to take the other girls out on a date. It's sort of like a sitcom premise almost.
Yeah.
But they go out together. Lux stays out all night on the football field with him. And as a consequence, the other girls are driven home. And when Lux comes back, the parents freak out. Mom locks the girls up, imprisoning them essentially in the house
Yeah.
until the climax with what ends up being the Virgin Suicides. Now, what
Right.
I wanted to mention was this movie reminded me a great deal of Carrie, Brian De Palma's Carrie, complete with the time period, complete with the girl's burgeoning sexuality, complete with the
Right.
kind of the stud who goes out with the one girl, breaks her heart, and ends up having catastrophic consequences for a lot of people. The overt religious, overtones. This is, even though it's not overtly a horror movie, maybe if I didn't have Carrie in my subconscious, I wouldn't think of this as a horror film, but it's almost like the indie art house version of Carrie. You don't have to have, flaming bleachers and doors slamming on their own. You can just have very quick shots, like the it's not even a montage, it's more like a walk through a house of horrors. It's like a minute
Yeah.
of screen time total to see what happened to all four girls, and it's masterfully done.
Well, it's funny about the ending and the reveal of the suicides. It kind of tripped me up as far, no pun intended. It tripped me up because um, throughout the film, and Giovanni Ribisi is the narrator. Obviously
Oh, is
somebody
that
is
him?
remembering this.
I
Yeah,
didn't know that was him. Wow.
yeah. So it's obviously it's a remembrance of a time past. So somebody looking back, narrating the film, and we see Trip as an older person, uh, and that we'll talk about that. But in the sense, it's all done in a kind of a moony nostalgia and the mystery of the girls all committing suicide and all that stuff. The artifacts, the fact that they're obsessed about talking about it every time. But because the boys were there, you'd think they'd be traumatized by the incident rather than moony and nostalgia about loving the Lisbon sisters. I think if an incident happened in that in real life, you'd always have like a shiver of I want to forget this rather than back in '75 when I was a young man. It's like it's
Well,
almost like
it's
the Waltons. I was like,
well,
I just didn't. It didn't match the trauma did not match the Mooney nostalgia of it. But it's a small complaint. But I understand the tone of the film that relied on that nostalgia. There's no nostalgia like nostalgia, and it relied on that tone, but it didn't, connect with me as a viewer in this day and age and state of mind, I guess. So
that
I'm
didn't.
always traumatized, is basically what I'm saying.
Well, it's an interesting point. I will probably have that in mind next time I watch the movie. But what I
Yeah.
took from it was the narration. And again, another thing I'll take into it is I don't think I realized again that Giovanni Ribisi was narrating as the older version of one of the
Uh-huh.
boys we see in the film. So it makes the voice now matches up because it's kind of strange, but it's not like a wistful Wonder Years sort of narration. He does sound
Hmm.
very kind of like sad, almost wistful, but kind of frustrated that there's this big mystery that no one could quite unlock, despite these artifacts, despite kind of the clues.
Right.
And what I loved about it was we hear so much talk about the male gaze as being a
Right.
negative thing, like, a predatory kind of horn dog. This was a different take on the male gaze, which is that men are fascinated by women because they are, and women and girls and stuff, because they are a mystery to them.
Ah,
um you know
that's
i
really that's really an essential point for this movie, an essential point.
and some people, they don't care about that mystery because they just want to get into a girl's pants. We see that with a lot of the guys that Lux has been with. She
Right.
doesn't, we're led to believe that she doesn't quite die a virgin. But whenever
Right.
this quartet of boys, these main characters, who you get the feeling they're kind of sweet, they're innocent, they're younger, they're more on
Right.
the younger side of things. They just want to maybe go out with these girls. They're kind of
Right.
like squiggly hearts and stuff in love with them, but they talk
Yes.
to people who've had intimate knowledge with at least some of them, just more of a fascination, like, oh my gosh, what was it like? And of course, one guy's like, you want to know what she was like? You want to smell my finger? And I'm like,
Yeah, exactly.
wow. But the
The
overall, I would say the overall tone of it is one
yeah.
of reverence and kind of sadness that their lives were cut short.
Yeah, and like I said, that was the tone that she was expressing, but the actuality of the events in the film might have caused a different type of reaction. But this is Ribisi, whoever he's representing. I don't know which of the four boys, but this is what he came out of it with, which is interesting. And you're right with the squiggly heart sort of thing. There was that. I can testify as a 15-year-old, 1975. You have 1 foot into your horn dog years and 1 foot into that traditional sense of the post World War II era where everybody sets up a family. I don't think there's that sense for a 15-year-old like that today. Okay.
Mm,
So that was what was remarkable that she took out Eugenides' book, that she was able to capture the feeling of young adolescence where you are not necessarily thinking about sex. You just don't know it. You just
right.
don't know you're thinking about sex. You're just thinking of your obsessions. And the way she posed the girls in some of the scenes, it was sexual, but it was also again like sculptures. Like if you're in a museum and you see four girls lounging around, they may have, incredible body parts and everything, and you're looking at that, but you're also looking at the overall picture of the mood, what they're establishing by those positions. That's why I think, besides Dazed and Confused, this is the most authentic feeling film I have for looking back at my youth.
And it's a great point. Because there's a couple of things that stand out in my mind to what you just said.
Uh-huh.
Some of these boys have visions of particularly Cecilia, the youngest who kills herself in the beginning of the film. One of which is one of the most striking, I think, images of the film, where he kind of one of the boys looks up into the trees and sees her sprawled out in the nightgown that she, killed herself
Yeah.
in. But it's almost like she's a cat, like the way she's splayed out in the branches. She looks like a cat, kind of like lazing in the tree, watching very curiously. Of course, then she disappears. Later, they find um, it's no, it's not scrapbooks. It's when the girls are locked up in their house by their parents, the only way that the boys can communicate is they start calling the house and playing records, and they play records back to each other without actually conversing. But they also find out that the Lisbon sisters have begun ordering a bunch of like mail order travel catalogs. And so the boys get
Uh,
on the same subscription list. And as they're thumbing through, like, oh, I bet they're imagining going on safari in Africa, we see a montage of the
yeah.
boys and the girls together on these adventures. It's not sexual, it's not erotic. We
Right.
see
Right.
Cecilia dressed up as, I think the kid says, and and at one point Cecilia became an Indian bride or something like that. And but it's
If
not,
she never died, she became an Indian bride. Yeah.
right. So that's what I'm getting at. I think I'm what you picking up on from your interpretation is there is
Mhm.
an innocence to it, almost a virgin attitude toward the mystery of the opposite
Right.
sex that doesn't necessarily involve sex itself.
Well, and they're looking at it from a point of view of a nesting sort of thing. Let's nest with these women rather than, you know, and that's why Lux breaks it up so much because she's the most overt sexual uh, of the four sisters, and her overt sexuality throws off the balance of that mooniness, I guess. And, to your point, the scene where the guy says, "Smell my finger," so which is
You wanted to mention the adult Trip,
yeah.
played by
Yes, I did.
Michael Pere.
He
Yeah,
fascinated me to no end. How many scenes does he have? Like three or four, maybe, or two or three? I'm not
two or
sure.
three. Yeah,
Played by the actor Michael Pere. I think his name is Pare.
with an
He was
accent.
a,
Yeah,
a hot guy, huh?
with an
Is it?
accent over the e. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's how it is. I'm not sure. Oh, yes, it is. Thank you. I got it right. Um, he was a hot guy when he was younger. So basically, Coppola found the hot guy that could possibly be Trip back in the day, and she sees him in a setting where we come to find out is most likely a rehab center,
Yeah.
or an institution in which he's going a sanitarium of some sort, or he's going to, rest his brain, um, because we don't see from the four, since we have the disembodied narrator representing the four boys apart from Trip, the guys in the neighborhood. Um, Trip is the only one representing what the trauma did to somebody, because obviously he was affected by it. The only love of his life seemed to be Lux at the point that he's talking as an adult, even though he mentions that he never had any problem with female companionship. So I just found those scenes so fascinating, and it almost makes me want to read the book to see if that's expanded in the book, because I've never read the book. So
I haven't
um,
either. I forgot it was based on a novel, but yeah, I kind of want to
yes,
read the book too, because, and I think I had forgotten that it was based on a book until the end credits began to roll.
right,
Because
right.
what struck me was how, and I'm a guy, you're a guy, so we can only talk theoretically, but it struck me as a very insightful, moving portrait of young femininity that we don't get to see very often. But then
Well,
I come to find out that it's based on a novel written by a guy. So apparently
right.
Sofia Coppola found some insight in that work that she responded to and thought was very honest, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I've read his other novel, and I can't think of the name of it right now, but I have read him. So I would be interested in reading The Virgin Suicides now, just to understand more of the expansion of the characters. And one of the authenticities that I picked up that, you may not necessarily know because of your younger status in this world, is that marriages devolved they devolved into what we saw with the Wood and Turner characters. You know, the familiarity of it. There's a pattern, a routine. There's a dominance in the household. Kathleen Turner's character. In those days, there were rarely few divorces in the middle class. You know, they just stayed together because they found a way to get their finances pooled, to get that house, to get those kids, and that was their life. You know, I mean, I grew up with that. There, you never heard of anybody getting a divorce, and then 20 years later, every kid I knew of some parent who had a divorce. Like, you know, there was no, the rules were off for the middle class. They could go and get divorced. And this was a movie about classism, by the way, because the boys, presumably the four boys in the neighborhood who mooned over the Lisbon sisters, were of an upper middle class professional or health class that was separate from the girls. And we see, because they're in a religious household, that's one of the aspects of a lower or middle class, lower middle class people, however, you know, their financial structure and their life was. They tend to go more towards religion, whereas the boys' parents tend to go to the club and have several martinis and have a key party. So, you know,
Well, I don't I want to push back on that a bit because
okay,
we don't see much of the boys' households, but I mean they all go to the same school. Now,
right,
and it's a private school. You know, the girls are all wearing the dresses. I mean, Trip kind of skirts that line because he takes his, boy's uniform of the button-down shirt and the slacks, and he's got like the open shirt and the wider collar. But just because, and I understand that the girls may have had a leg up in going to that school because their dad's on the faculty. But I mean, I can
right.
attest that you don't have to be of that upper class in order to go to that school. I mean, I went to, a Catholic high school for 2 years till the money
Right.
ran out. And then I went to a public school. I can understand, maybe you've got something there. I just didn't see it come across really in the story because there's not.
Well, and again, the classes were mixing more in the 70s. There wasn't, there wasn't that distinction. Well, again, circumstances and how you grow up, that's a different thing. But from my observation of classism when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I simply did not notice it. I
Mm,
grew up in the middle class enclave, and beyond that, yeah, you knew somebody had a nice house, maybe in a particular neighborhood, but you didn't think about it as, oh, they've got way more than I do. I'm envious. I
right.
just, now this is just my experience. And the Catholic school that I went to had a mix of classes in it because,
Yeah.
again, there wasn't the education structure that we have now where you can go to different levels of schools depending on what you can afford. And you mentioned that James Woods' character, the math teacher, that's probably why they were able to go to the school. I can testify. My mother was in the diocese school system that I went to school in. One of the perks was that all the kids went free to any kind of school within
Free.
the diocese. So
Wow.
they didn't have to pay tuition for my younger siblings in grade school, and they didn't have to pay tuition at Marquette High School where I went. And my sister, myself, and my brother all went there. It was perfect timing for that. And my mother said that was a significant savings in the household budget.
Oh, yeah.
That knowing they were going a pretty good school, not a great school, but a pretty good school, private school, and it was gratis. So
Yeah, I mean,
interesting, huh?
when I went in the early 90s, it was, thousands of dollars a year. I can only imagine
Oh,
what it
I
is now.
know. It's
Yeah.
it's it's like a freaking college tuition.
Hmm.
It's crazy.
But one
So
thing oh, go ahead.
well, let's see. I'm just looking at my notes here. There here's a weird memory that came out watching it, and you'll love this. This is so, I mean, I think about it, so I can picture the classroom. As a freshman class fundraiser, we're talking 1970 freaking four. Um, we we were doing like a fundraiser where we're, maybe a quarter, a chance or something, whereas you would get various prizes. And one of the prizes was the Styx 2 album with the famous song Lady on it.
Yeah.
I can still picture the person giving the pitch. I can still picture the album in her hand. I can still remember the songs associated with the album. It's just weird how your memory works, and what you maintain in there is something that's significant, even though it seems super trivial, and actually it is, you know. So,
Did that come
and
to you during the
interestingly,
record burning scene?
oh my, that hit my heart, man. That hit my heart. Yeah, yeah,
It's
that was crazy. I can imagine my parents coming in and saying, "I'm burning all your albums. You'll never listen to them again." I'm like, "What?" You know, because
well,
that was my survival mode back then.
well, yeah, and same with Dazed and Confused. That was sort of a bit of escapism
Yes,
there too. But no, what I loved about that
and I think,
oh, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say
Oh,
what I
I'm
loved
just
about that
hilarious. Alphon and Gaston. Go ahead.
what I loved was that scene was Kathleen Turner made Lux, the daughter, burn the records herself. And there's this kind of a tearful struggle of like going down the stairs with this crate of albums to the fireplace.
Amazing.
And then she's like,
Yeah.
not Aerosmith, don't make me burn Aerosmith, not Kiss too. But what was great was she was throwing these things onto the fire. The smoke and the chemicals were creating such a problem that eventually the mom couldn't like admit defeat. Like this was a really dumb idea. She just had to say,
Right.
I'll throw the rest out with the trash. Just, we're done here. Go up to your room.
Yeah.
It's that
Yeah.
power play that is all throughout this movie. And again, similar to what happened in Carrie.
And you know, growing up in the circumstances that I did throughout the era, there was a shared element, especially in the white middle class enclaves I ran with, the shared element of music. It's much more portrayed in Dazed and Confused, and you know, they're just sharing all this amazing stuff that's swirling around them. That's in the cars, it's on the radios. Everybody knows every song. They're high fiving each other, et cetera, et cetera. Although the high five didn't exist then, it was a low five. But anyway, you know, and I'm not speaking for every class strata in America. Obviously, you know, African Americans listening to a different thing, you know, but there was more of a universal tie to music back then. We were all listening to the same thing. When I interviewed Richard Linklater, one of the questions I asked him was, how could you depict a high school 3,000, 2,000 miles away from where I lived, and it can be exactly the same? It was exactly the same experience. He said, because we shared all the media. And I'm like, of course. We shared the silos of the media, which included the pop music and the rock music of the era. And again, I'm not speaking for everybody in the United States. I'm speaking for my social strata and what we were sharing. See how politically correct I am?
Well, and I understand that, but what I'm saying is,
Yeah,
even though things were not as, you know, not, I was gonna, what's the opposite of homogenous, like heterogeneous? I don't know, but
yeah, yeah. I
things
know
were
what
not
you're
as
saying.
right. Things were not as culturally mixed back then as they are now. But I imagine what you're
Right,
saying, again, speculation, because I wasn't even around, is that each community, if you want to call it that, probably had a similar experience of media. Because when you talk about
right,
here's the top 40 songs in the United States, there was probably like
right,
50 songs. There's like 10 that didn't make the cut, as opposed to
right.
now where it's like 10 million videos and songs in your phone, in your pocket. Not to
Exactly.
mention YouTube videos and things like that. So
Right.
it was a much smaller pool to influence, larger groups of people, even if those groups weren't necessarily unified. There were pockets, and they probably shared similar cultures or
One
similar
thing I'll say
obsessions.
too,
Yeah,
you brought up YouTube, and occasionally everybody does this. You know, they go down the rabbit hole of YouTube, whereas one video connects to another video and another. Well, of course, you know, sometimes I'm going to go and see. Nick Allen and we opened the show in August with Olivia Newton-John's "If You Love Me, Let Me Know. If You Don't, Then Let Me Go." You know, It was because as a tribute to her. So, I'm looking up the video, I'm looking up, and what interests me is the comments. And one comment in particular that's underneath every nostalgic pop song and rock song of the era, that presumably people my age saying, "Oh my God, the music was so much better then, so much better. It was so much kinder and blah." And I always write underneath their comment, "And bonus, you were young." And that's what it is, man. You were young. It
It's
meant more to you. It's in your DNA. And
and
yet,
we started talking, kind of started off this conversation talking about this generational shift, because I have no idea what the kids are listening to now. My sense is there's not a whole lot that's good out there, but is that just the same thing that parents in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s said about the
yeah,
previous generations? I'm just trying to figure out, like, 20
it's
years
tough
from
to
now, what's
say.
going to be nostalgic? Is WAP going to be, on on the top, the oldie station? Are
There's
people
always
connecting
going to
with
be
WAP?
an ear, yeah, there's always going to be an earworm song. But I listen to the, here's something. I just don't find any relevance in the pop rock music of today. I hear a lot of sounds. They're experimenting with sounds because I think a musician, say a musician since he was 8 years old and he's now 19 or 20. So that's 12 years of developing this atmospheric thing where you can get any sound in the universe and put it in your song. Okay. So the sonic nature of music right now is probably at its peak, but the insight, the melding of lyric and melody, I think, is on the downturn. I don't think people have. There's very few people that have the introspection, for example, and the mix of experiences of a Elton John or a John Lennon, whereas they're putting their soul and heart. That's actually Bernie Taupin, but they're putting their soul and heart into these lyrics and trying to find a way to meld them with a hook or a fill so that it creates a 330 masterpiece. I said I don't have a religion anymore, but I believe in the religion of the 330 pop song.
Well, to that point, this movie has, I think Roger
Incredible
Ebert.
soundtrack.
Well, but Roger Ebert had a rule. I think it was called the M. Emmett Walsh, Harry Dean Stanton rule, which is any movie featuring those two actors was at least good on some level. For me, it's the Hollies, "The Air That I Breathe" rule. I find that any movie featuring that song has to have something going for it, because that's a beautiful, powerful song
Right.
that is musically interesting and lyrically
Yes.
powerful, and
Yeah.
it shows up here. So again, I'm thinking 30 years from now, someone's going to be in love with "The Air That I Breathe." Are they going to
Yeah.
be quoting WAP?
Well, also too, it's just you hear those chords of that song, very familiar, of course, to me because of the era it came through. And what was that Steve Carell movie? Something in the End of the World.
That's where I first really fell in love with it.
That's where that
Yeah.
Holly song is used so beautifully. You're almost weeping. You
Hmm.
know.
I was a
Uh,
mess during that scene. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's crazy. But yeah, that's a good one. The Hollies rule, the air that I breathe rule.
Yes.
Let's see how many films it's been used in, and see if it's used significantly, because it's used significantly in this. I love the music exchange scene, obviously, because I can picture myself doing that, and I love too that after all thinking about Morse code and all the ways they could communicate. Well, why don't we just call them? They bring out
Yeah.
the phone book and there's their number. They call them, they answer, and they start that chain. And it's so beautifully done. It's just it just a little flaw there because didn't their mother take all their music?
As
But
far as
suddenly,
she knew. As far as she
I
knew.
guess that's true.
Yeah.
That's to something. As soon as that would happen, you would obviously go, "I'm hiding this 45. I'm hiding. I have to have this," because
Well,
man, I'll tell you. Go ahead.
oh, no, I was going to say, finish your thought, please.
just that music is so important. At least that's why I relate so much to what happens in that scene, because that's it is how how you would communicate with somebody if you were making a connection. I mean, I would always, when I would ride home from college, getting rides from various people, on my lap the whole journey, no matter what seat I was sitting in, I always had 25 albums on my lap because I had to bring them home, even though I was playing them on my old stereo, because my new stereo was at school. I had to have those albums to get through the Christmas break or whatever it was. It just
For
was it, and that's one of the reasons I picked up on being a musician later in my life, because I wanted to have the experience of what I experienced. I wanted to give the experience I had received from the experience of those pop songs. And speaking of which, the Darkroom Men are going to open the opening night at the Chicago International Film Festival.
Really?
We got it was crazy. It hasn't. We're going to officially announce it within the next couple of days. We're still getting the parameters together, but yeah, we're going to be doing a set at the corner of Waveland and Southport.
That's
We're
right. They're
doing a
doing that like
one.
street festival thing. Yeah.
Yep, yep. So we got I couldn't believe when Vivian Tang, the managing director, sent the note, but it was Nick that convinced her. I was like, how the hell did she hear about us? I thought maybe she saw us on Facebook or something, but no, Nick said, hey, by the way, Pat and I have an act.
Well, when you get all the information, let me know,
Yes,
and I'll drop it in the description of this video so people can
excellent,
find it. Yeah.
excellent,
But
excellent, excellent.
before we go, I do want to talk because I want to
Yes.
bring this back around to horror. That scene
Oh,
where the
yes.
boys go to the Lisbon house at midnight,
Right, right,
because the girls, kind of signal that to do that. They think they're gonna go steal them away, and there's this great like fantasy scene of them kind of in the station
right.
wagon driving somewhere. It's all sunny and nice. They encounter Lux, who invites them in and says, my sisters are waiting for you. Turns out they were all
Mhm.
pretty much already dead by that point. She goes off to the garage to die in the car.
Yeah,
What did you the first time you saw this, and you hadn't read the book, so aside from the title, you didn't quite know what to expect, I imagine. Was
right.
it as shocking to you as it was to me? Because I thought it was gonna be like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thing throughout the movie, but no, like they just all go in one go.
Yeah, again, viewing it in this experience through the filter of many, many similarly themed films over the years, it was shocking. It's still shocking. I think the shocking nature, more shocking is the girl impaled on the fence, but it's pretty stark the way they show the ending. I mean, you're seeing every specific suicide. Uh, um, it it just made me feel sad that this was a result of the whole thing, and it's almost like as a viewer you want to reach out and understand the point where they made that pact and trying to bring it back somehow. Uh, they were particularly damaged, and the boys could do nothing about it essentially.
And then there's this eerie kind of an epilogue, like a postscript to that, which I
Yes,
had completely forgotten about, which is, a year later, whatever, local society had moved on to the point where they had
right.
a debutante ball whose theme was asphyxiation. And you got people walking
Yes.
around in gas masks. Everything has this green kind of a toxic sheen to it. And then finally at the end, you see the boys back in this kind of golden lit street, and they're, kind of lighting lighters for the Lisbon girls. It's a lovely
Yeah.
ending, but yeah, that I think that
But
epilogue
that
is
I go back to
critical.
the trauma of it, and it's incongruous to the trauma of what has occurred. Um, that was a little nod to the upper wealth class too. That whole dead ball, because a factory had been spewing toxic gas into the air around Grosse Pointe, and the smell that was the summer of the smell.
That's right,
And
yeah.
that's why the asphyxiation theme came up with the dead ball, and just the whole bougie nature of it. You're just like because James Woods, before he turned into a right wing asshole, he was actually a fantastic actor. And the nuances he put into that math teacher, he was not a bad guy. He had just simply fallen into a situation where he could do what he loved, which was explain math concepts. That was his whole passion of life. And he allowed his wife, Kathleen Turner, to be a religious nut and raise their daughters accordingly. He didn't have much to say about that. I mean, that's why the television scene is so telling. They're watching one of the most innocuous things on television, but everybody's rapt attention. Either they're insecure about Tripp being there, or this is what they do as a family every night. And I knew hundreds of families like that growing up. That was their routine, and that was their structure of the marriage. Whereas one person had a passion, the other person took care of the house, and they seemed as separate as two people can be. And beautifully acted by both people, by both Kathleen Turner and James Wood. And I didn't mean to mention about his right-wing assholism.
No, I mean
that's a part.
No, I mean, like, point taken. I mean, there is definitely there is definitely a shift, between late 90s James Woods and what we know of him today. But a lot of that, I don't know. What was that? Was he the same guy? He just didn't have the internet.
Right. Precisely, and we can do a whole podcast on the James Woods eras. But yes, you're correct. Maybe he was like that always. And that was another thing, everything was apolitical in the 70s, because once Watergate broke everything open, the trust in government just went away, and people just tried to avoid talking or knowing about government, no matter what your party affiliation was. There was a golden age. It was almost like the great breath out. After Nixon resigned, I would say from 74 to when the campaign started in 1980 between Reagan and Carter. And that's when the dirty tricksters came back to the Republican Party and started making their inroads again, and the divisiveness of the nation started again. But we had a great sigh of relief, I like to call it, after Watergate, politically in this country. Now, I was young, but I also observed, and I also know the history, and I know that was the case. The great sigh after Vietnam, after Watergate, we all needed a break, and there was no internet, and we only had the 3 news outlets in your local news, so you picked up on the information, but you didn't necessarily analyze it like they do today. It's crazy, so stupid.
Well, and that's something that this movie is, pretty much apolitical. I mean, it talks about
it's throwing back to that time,
right. It's not something
storm of that time.
Right. And I don't think that you would have this movie be made today, or at least not in the same way, because I think the idea of like feminism would have been, played more heavily into it. It was almost like an undercurrent when you were talking about the family staying together, as a lot of families did, and divorce was kind of unheard of. This is like right in the heart of, probably second wave feminism. And so the idea of like, even if they had thought about it, they're like, well, we've already been married, for a decade before this was even considered a possibility. We're not going to become pariahs in our own community. We're going to stick this out.
All the girls were born in the early 70s, or I'm sorry, early 60s.
60s, yeah.
Even the youngest at 13 would have been born in 1962. So you're talking, a foot, and he was born in 1960. It was a foot into the post-World War II era. It was entrenched back then. And so, yeah, people forget about that when looking at social economic structures to your point, second wave feminism. Feminism crested in the early 70s when a lot of inroads were made. And then the wave kept going until, breaking on the shore, and then dissipated when Reagan got into office. So,
well, it's also
the great sigh of relief.
Well, it's also the idea of, there's this idea of like looking back on old media and saying, well, why didn't people do this or stand up and all this other stuff? It wasn't in the air the way that it is now. If someone brought to the table like, hey, why don't you just leave your husband? Instead of saying, yeah, you can look at these videos or watch these shows or read these articles about how great and liberating it is and how it's going to be okay. they'd fall back on 200 years of tradition, be like, no one's gonna talk to me if I leave my husband. What are you talking about?
And that's what bothers me about movies set in the past these days. When I see a movie set in the past these days, number one, I'm obsessed with them getting it right, you know. And when I see an anachronism, it just, my mind blows. I'm out of the movie sometimes, really, seriously.
Yeah.
But they always, they seem to be filtering young filmmakers or 30-something filmmakers or 40-something filmmakers. They're always creating the past through the lens of today, to your point. We don't know what it's like to live in the 1950s as a black person. No, there's just no way we could call that up. But I can make a film about it, and I can put my point of view into it, and you're going to go, well, I don't know if that happened that way. Well, of course it didn't, because I'm a white man, and I don't know.
Right.
You know,
I mean,
or feminists or gay people or whatever, you know. The lens of today does not lend itself to the social structure of the past.
right. And it's hard to make a movie that would depict exactly what those struggles were, because it's
Right.
in a lot of cases it would be hard to have anything resembling hope or a happy ending.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Even in the brightest of civil rights, you know, era movies, there's rarely a happy ending.
Yeah.
I mean, you can talk about the FBI infiltrating all those movements and trying to break them up. That's not happy. That's
No.
evil, you know. So what it's almost impossible to get a feeling of it. There has to be a tone, and she created a tone, and I think she was helped by the fact that she was so immersed in 70s ethos, through her father and all the great films of the era, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
hey, that's what a great choice again, Ian. I can't, we debated a bit, and I understand your themes for October, and horror being my least genre. You gave me a good horror film that also gave me a little nostalgia, and I really appreciated that. So,
Well,
it's
I appreciate you agreeing to do this. I think it's been a really fun discussion about a movie
it
that
really has.
is not that fun, but it's still a fascination. So, yeah.
Yes, and I highly, highly recommended to get a sense of just adolescence and the dreams of adolescence and how they can be dashed by forces that are outside their nature in a sense.
Yeah. It's a great coming of age story, and a kind of an
Yeah,
unconventional one that I don't think enough people talk about. So hopefully we'll change that with this conversation. But all right, Pat,
excellent.
thank you very much. We'll catch you next month talking about
Excellent.
it's your choice next month. I chose this month. You're gonna deal with
Well,
something
remember,
cool.
I'll send you the title again, but it's the obscure science fiction film from 1963. I'm not going to go through my DVDs and try to find it, but I will send you the title. If you go back to last month's, you can get the title
I
for all
shall.
you fans out
Or
there.
maybe I'll just, yeah, the fans can do it. I'll just wait for Pat to email me. No, all right. All right. Thank you, sir. Take care and stay spooky.
Happy Halloween.
All right. Bye, man.